Hello everyone, my name is Kanengoni. I'm a fourth year clinical trial specialist apprentice at Syneos Health as well, and I'm currently working in the research, inclusion and representation team. So for context on why I've chosen this subject today, I was born in Zimbabwe and I'm ethnically Shona Zezuru. I have a lot of family in Zimbabwe, and the importance of exposing the realities of underserved communities is something that is very close to my heart. Um, so in 2022, the African continent accounted for 17% of the global population, although it carries 25% of the global disease burden. It only has 1 to 2% of all trials conducted in the world. So, despite African nations being major sites in prevention and treatment of infectious diseases, the same enthusiasm does not translate to non communicable diseases such as cancer and women's health. So, trial results aren't truly effective as they do not reflect the diverse ethnicities and genetic backgrounds of individuals from southern, west, east, and northern regions of Africa. This further exacerbates the already existing health inequalities across the continent. So in this presentation, I'll be exploring how the historical mistreatment under colonial rule has impacted current inclusion and trust in clinical research. And we'll be looking at some key cases and their implication for our present day, as well as recommendations and current work that is being done in African nations to ensure that trial results are as representative of the populations as they can be. So first, we need to understand that the lack of trials on the continent of Africa is not solely due to historical mistreatment. In comparison to countries such as the USA, UK, France, and Germany, African nations have weaker regulatory infrastructure. Each country has its own regulatory process, and most countries are not under a unified submission system such as the EU's European Medicines Agency. So pharmaceutical companies will have to deal with extended timelines and duplications in their application process. In addition, there's a lack of trained researchers due to brain drain, which is the emigration of skilled and educated individuals from a poorer country to gain better opportunities, though this ultimately negatively impacts the country of origin economically. The lack of trained researchers slows down the start of the clinical trial process, and these researchers would have an understanding of the local disease prevalence. So without this, the clinical trial designed may not be the actual reality of the local populations. When trials are conducted on the African continent, they tend to be primarily concentrated in South Africa or in Egypt, and this deepens the gap in representation across Central, West, and Francophone regions of the African continent. A lot of the research conducted in high-income countries tend to focus on non-communicable diseases such as Alzheimer's or allergies, and for African nations, there isn't the same prevalence of these conditions. Rather, there's a higher rate of infectious diseases such as malaria and tuberculosis. Consequently, these trials are culturally irrelevant and further exacerbate the health inequalities across the continent. So, what is the history of the colonial research? So, Sierra Leone, located in West Africa, was declared a British colony in 1808, and it was colonized as part of Britain's social control to reduce the undesirable poor Black free slaves by returning them to their ancestral land. Additionally, it was an opportunity for the British to expand their influence in West Africa and gain access to resources such as palm oil, ivory, and gold, and though they were faced with a significant challenge. These soldiers experienced high rates of mortality due to malaria, with 1 in 2 dying from the disease. This ignited the desire to understand the prevalence of malaria in the area. Sierra Leone became a test location for malaria control. Colonial officials collected data on how malaria affected African bodies versus European, with little to no effort being made to protect the Sierra Leonean majority from the disease. Experimentation followed Ross's example by implementing control methods that were tested on Sierra Leonean majority without proper consent. Colonial medical officers were encouraged to send pathological specimens, materials, and parasites to the London School of Tropical Medicine without patient consent. And racial segregation was seen as a method of reducing infection rates. The aim of this research was not to eradicate malaria in Sierra Leone, but to protect the colonial soldiers and administrators, test treatments for malaria elsewhere in the British Empire, and to advance the field of tropical medicine. In the early 1800s, due to the high rates of death amongst the British troops, Sierra Leone became known as the white man's grave. As malaria was not fully understood, the Sierra Leonean populations were viewed as naturally immune, which caused interest in the studying of their bodies. And through the 1850s to 1880s, quinine was introduced and stockpiled for British personnel. Care in hospitals were segregated and local populations were faced with negligent and even experimental treatment. In 1899, research by John Dutton focused on mosquito transmission, species identification, and the use of mosquito nets. The Sierra Leonean population unknowingly became subjects to his research. Consequently, swamps were drained and oil would be spread on breeding grounds as a way to protect colonial staff from the infection. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the introduction of controlled clinical studies often had the Sierra Leonean population involved without informed consent and the untreated control groups. Although Sierra Leone was involved in the World Health Organization's malaria control trials, public health still had an externally driven agenda with little local scientific leadership or training. Post-independence, the colonial legacy left behind limited research infrastructure with a deep mistrust of medical systems. And this wasn't only occurring in Sierra Leone. Between the 1920s and 1950s, the French colonial government held medical campaigns in Gabon, Chad, Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and Cameroon to treat and prevent sleeping sickness. The motivation was to protect colonial workforce and economic productivity, similar as the case in Sierra Leone. A Toxol, arsenic-based drug developed in France, became the main treatment. It was administered en masse to entire villages without consent. Many of the locals were given improper dosings, which led to mass blindness and deaths. And those who refused to partake in the experimental treatment were beaten, imprisoned, or forcibly injected. Locals were rounded up and examined. Those suspected of being sick were sent to internment camps for observation and drug testing. Consent was non-existent. Locals were stigmatized as being disease carriers, and the French government weaponized medicine to reinforce the colonial control as a result, generational mistrust in clinical research. Unfortunately, this didn't all stop post-independence. Colonial attitudes remained, and some of the pharmaceutical companies exploited this for their own gain. Most notably, the Pfizer-Trovan trial in Nigeria. In 1996, the meningitis epidemic broke out in Kano in northern Nigeria. Pfizer sent a team to conduct a trial on Trovan, which was an experimental antibiotic that was not yet approved for pediatric use. The trial involved 200 children. Half were given Trovan, and the other half were given ceftriaxone, which was the standard treatment at the time. Though allegedly, this was given at a lower dose than recommended. Parents were not told that their children were in a clinical trial, believing that Pfizer was providing free humanitarian aid. There was a lack of ethics approval from the relevant Nigerian authorities, and at least 11 children died, and many were left with brain damage, deafness, or paralysis. Pfizer insisted that these were as a result of the meningitis, despite the inadequacies of the trial protocol and monitoring. This case goes to show the influence of colonial powers between the global North pharmaceutical companies and the global South populations. So how does this past impact our present? How does colonial and unethical clinical research continue to impact participation, access, and innovation across the continent of Africa? Generations of communities remember or hear about these violations. They have become cautionary tales amongst households, so continuing to fuel the mistrust. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there were rumors of African populations being used as guinea pigs in vaccine trials, leading to public protests in Senegal, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Nigeria. Meanwhile, in the UK, reports found that Black African and Caribbean communities had the lowest uptake rates of the vaccine, often stating that mistrust of the medical systems was the reason why. When certain countries are included in trials, they may wait years to access the same medications. Herceptin, a treatment for breast cancer, was approved in the US in 1998 but wasn't made available through public systems in African countries until over a decade later due to the lack of trial data available from these populations. Similarly, sickle cell disease treatments such as hydroxyurea have been the standard in high-income countries since the 90s. But in countries such as Nigeria, which has the highest global disease burden for the condition, still have limited access. Exclusion means that African nations miss out on funding, infrastructure, jobs, and capacity building. Researchers in Ghana and Zambia have expressed frustration towards being excluded from authorship and decision-making, even when international trials are conducted locally. In 2022, it was highlighted that over 60% of trials conducted in sub-Saharan Africa had no African authors on their final publications. So that cut off opportunities for local research growth. So what does it look like to now include African nations in trials? What work is currently being done and what can be done to improve clinical research across the continent? Research in African nations has predominantly examined infectious diseases such as malaria, HIV, and TB. They are significant in these nations, but they are not the only diseases experienced by local populations. By expanding trial portfolios, it creates more equitable and diversified portfolios. Rising rates of cancer, an epidemic of hypertension and strokes, rare diseases that aren't rare diseases are largely ignored. Yet by including these trials, it not only benefits public health, it improves the science that could shape the future therapies globally. Equity begins with leadership by people with knowledge. Organizations like the African Clinical Research Network are showing that it's possible to have trials designed, led, and managed by South African, Rwandese, Tanzanian, and Zimbabwean researchers. Locally led research isn't just about representation, but about the relevance and the trust that it provides. By strengthening infrastructure through regional agencies, it ensures that equity is systemic. The African Medicines Agency, a pan-African regulatory body, focuses on harmonizing approval processes and safeguarding trial ethics. Additionally, the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry ensures transparency, reduces duplication, and increases the visibility of African-based studies. By uniting under regional agencies, fragmentation can be reduced and continent-wide standards can be developed to make trials in Africa more secure for ex-Africa sponsor companies. Initiatives such as H3 Africa, Africa CDC, and the African Clinical Trials Consortium are powerful continental collaborations that prove that it's possible to reshape the research ecosystem in the continent. The underrepresentation of African nations in clinical trials is not just a scientific oversight. It is a continuation of a long-standing legacy rooted in colonial exploitation and systemic exclusion. This history has bred deep mistrust, fractured infrastructure, and a lack of ownership over trial data and innovation. The future of clinical research on the African continent lies in meaningful inclusion, where local scientists, institutes, and communities are not just participants, but leaders. This means supporting regulatory harmonization, investing in local capacity and infrastructure, ensuring ethical and transparent research practices, and expanding the scope of research beyond infectious diseases. To conclude, representation in research is about equity, accuracy, and justice. It's about ensuring that the people who bear the greatest disease burden are a part of shaping the solution. So let's prioritize partnership over parachuting, collaboration over colonization, and trust over tokenism. Then we can begin to dismantle the mistrust due to the past and build an equitable future where clinical research serves us all. Thank you very much.
Excellent and very important talk. Thank you so much.
No
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Please. Anja, please go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see your hands up.
That's okay. Hi, Peace. Thank you so much for that talk. It's a really important area to be highlighting, and anybody who's come into the Level 4 summer school this summer will be touching on these areas. But as you know, Peace, we cover some of that. But it was really good to go into much more depth. And I think I don't really have a question as such as just to kind of say that, you know, we present sort of like the GCP regulations and things as the answer to all of these things, but there is still clearly so much more work that is required to make this equitable for everybody. And yeah, I thank you for highlighting all of those areas, and that's really interesting, and thank you.
No problem. Thank you very much.
I think we've got another question. Tyler, please, if you go ahead.
Hi. Yes, that was a really good talk, Peace. Thank you so much. Some of the things I'd heard before, but most of it I definitely hadn't. So it was really informative. I don't know if you know the answer to this question, but do you know now, like in current policy, if somebody is to go and do some research, say they're American or European researchers and they want to go to a country within Africa and do some research, is there anything in place that means they have to consult someone from that community beforehand? Because that seems like that would be a good first step for people to make sure they're not, even if you do the logical thing and do everything by ethics, you could still do something unconsciously if you don't know that culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to the question and definitely will look into it. I think the natural assumption is that I don't think so. Especially the work that I'm currently doing in the research and representation team in Syneos. So in the UK, there's a lot of the research is concentrated in England, but regions such as Northern Ireland and Wales you just don't really see them in clinical trials. And naturally that medication would go out there. So I think it's one of those things where the assumption is that someone would go and they would find out from local populations, but the more kind of work that I'm doing, I'm finding that it's not the reality, which is really unfortunate, but I'll definitely look into it because I might be wrong.
It
But
seems like something that would be worthwhile having
yeah.
for any country, really, that if you're going to do any research or send any medication there, that you reach out to somebody with knowledge of that community, not just somebody who has learnt about it from
Yeah.
reading, etc.
Yeah.
But thank you. Thanks, Peace.
Any more questions from anyone? I'm just checking if anyone's hand is up. Can't see anything. I've got one question, Peace. I think you mentioned Wanakam. I think you did, didn't you? Yeah.
I mentioned.
Wanakam. Was it the West African? I think I've heard, maybe I've just network for the clinical trials.
Mhm.
It was obviously in West Africa. Is that like something that is sort of connected with the European clinical trials as well network?
Are you referring to the African Medicines Agency?
Yeah, I think it's the West African Clinical Trials Wanakam organization that I think, because you were mentioning the West African countries, I was just wondering whether there's like a strong link between those clinical trial organizations and some European one as well to ensure the quality. Yeah.
So from what I found, the African Medicines Agency is backed by the World Health, no, it's backed by the EMA, and they've supported them in kind of their development as a unified body. And then the Pan-African Clinical Trials Registry, is a World Health Organization registry that kind of like allows for those studies to be registered through their database.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so hopefully that sort of like helps, to navigate
100%.
the diversity, but also the quality and inclusion and everything for the clinical trials. Thank you.
Yeah.